When it comes to the lustful milk gag, or the as TV trope calls it, I've explained it numerous times. But what's more intriguing about it is, what the character goes through when they end up doing that gag, or they end up portraying that trope. I mean, if we go back about almost 80 years, and we go back to the Swoonu Crooner short of, I think, 1944, 1945. If we go back to that, we know that one of the hens in that short ends up melting into a puddle with only her little frill remaining on top. And the way she melts, basically what she becomes as a puddle looks like, with a little frill remaining, like a fried egg that's rippling. On the sides, that is. And we're supposed to kind of pretend that she's been that way, or she remained that way for a couple of hours, while Porky's trying to find another bird to kind of, reverse the effects, if you know what I mean, that the Frank Sinatra characteristic rooster had on the hens. And thus you enter the Bing Crosby-like pigeon bird, and all the hens basically pop back to life, and the hen that melted basically pulls herself back together, kind of pops back up herself, reforms herself. But we're supposed to imagine that for a couple of hours she's remained that way. Like, you could just walk by and just say, oh, there's a rippling black puddle, and that's it. And it wouldn't bother you, because you wouldn't think it's a hen or anything like that. You wouldn't think that. So it's interesting to look at the different scenarios that the characters end up in. It's really interesting. And when I look at the more modern, cartoons of the 90s and stuff, it gets even more interesting. But it's not just Tiny Toons and Animaniacs either. It's also cartoons like Popeye. Popeye had the lustful milk trope in it for both him and Olive. But Olive's is the most notable one, seeing as though, she melted into a complete puddle with just a smiling face remaining on the puddle as she basically flows down the floor to end the cartoon, which is Polyvoo-Woos. And it's interesting to see, her do the trope, or be put into that position, and that that basically the scenario she's put in after she goes through the trope is she's flowing down the floor as the cartoon ends, and you see these little dry spots and everything show up in her. And it makes you wonder, okay, what happens next? Is that think about it. You're a kid and you're watching this and you're thinking, okay, is this the end of Olive? What's going on? And then you have to remind yourself, or your parents have to remind you, it's non-canon. It's not, connected to any other future short, because she's going to be back to normal anyway. But then you take a look at, like I said, the more modern takes of Animaniacs and Tiny Toons, and you look at the scenarios that the likes of Babs in Tiny Toons, Plucky in Tiny Toons, Minerva in Animaniacs, you take a look at the scenario those characters were in, after they went through the trope. For example, when Plucky did it in the Acme Bowl, he literally had to be scooped up in a cup, if you will, by Roderick Rat, and then poured out of the cup to be reformed, to snap himself out of it. And his reaction after being poured back into reformation was, who, what, where, why? Because he was completely gone. He was no longer a Plucky Duck. He was just a puddle with two eyes, floating in the hot tub, if you will. Or in the hot tub, the whirlpool, if you will. But then we get to Babs. Now, Babs has done it twice. Actually 3 times, but not really, if you count one little short they did, where both her and Plucky melted at the same time, but not completely, not in a way that you would know them to do. But Babs did it twice. The last official time she did it was in Wonderful Tiny Toon Christmas after getting kissed by Buster, and she melts right through her clothes. And then all that remains is her clothes and her eyes, which fall down on top of the puddle that she's become, and then that's it. She's basically now a puddle underneath her clothing and her eyes, and that's it. But we don't see her reform until later on. Well, basically we see her reformed, but it happens off screen. But then the first time she actually does it, though, as far as I know, is Europe in 30 Minutes. Europe in 30 Minutes was one of the final episodes of the first season. And in this episode, she melts into a puddle after she sees the royal couple. And after she melts into a puddle, you would think like Buster, when he did it in the pilot, A Loony Beginning, she would reform off screen, right? Nope. The scenario they had Babs go through after she did her first Lustful melt gag, if you want to call it that, in Europe in 30 Minutes, was not only did they have her melt into a puddle, but they had her remain that way while her friends ran through her. That's right. Her friends basically ran after the royal couple, and as they did so, they ran through Babs as she was a melted puddle on the floor. And by doing so, and this was a first for me when I saw it, they caused bits of her to splash all across the room, the hallway that they were in. And after they ran through her, that's when she popped up and reformed herself and followed after them. But then we get to Minerva. We get to Minerva and Animaniacs. And Minerva, in both Moon Over Minerva and Meet Minerva, does this gag. But in Moon Over Minerva, just like Plucky in the Acme Bowl, in the Acme Bowl episode of Tiny Toons, when Minerva does the Lustful melt gag trope in Moon Over Minerva, the scenario she's put in is Wilford has to be the one that picks her up and wrings her out like a red towel to restore her. And as he picks her up, we see basically a lot of her coloring, drip off like, she's a wet towel. Basically, you see all this wetness dripping off of her, if you know what I mean. And we kind of see it as well when she melts. We see like a little bit of wetness come off of her hair as she's melting. And then as she's melted, we see like little bits here and there that are separate from her, indicating she is now melted into a puddle, but it's a puddle that basically has to be reformed by Wilford. That's the scenario she's put into. Just like with Plucky, she has to be revived by somebody else out of her melted state, out of her melted comatose state. Now the second time she does it, of course, is Meet Minerva, and the scenario she put in there is she literally runs towards her best friend's cousin and melts literally through his arms. And the scenario she's put in with that version of the trope that she does is she's melting through his arms. She splits in half. So you have you have her upper half go to the left, and you have her bottom half go to the right, and then meet up, on the ground as a melted puddle with just her eyes closed and everything, before she reforms herself into a loud, obnoxious boat horn. So yeah, the scenarios they put these characters in when they would do the Lustful melt trope gag, if you will, is interesting because you really have to have, let's say, a physical copy of these episodes, of these shorts, playing on your Blu-ray or your DVD player, or even your 4K Ultra Blu-ray DVD, the 4K Ultra Blu-ray player, I'm trying to say. You need to have the physical version to pause and go frame by frame to see exactly what I'm talking about. And it's not just them either. it's not just them either. Like I said, Olive Oil and Popeye. And then, of course, later on in cartoons and episodes I didn't even know of. Like, for example, Captain Flamingo. They had a short called Blindsided. And in the short, one of the scenes is Captain Flamingo's trying to help out one of his friends with one of his inventions, which turns a voice into a swab voice. And basically, when he tested out on the female friend Elizabeth literally melts into a puddle, and all that remains on the puddle as it's spreading is her pigtails, and her pigtails are spreading out within the puddle, they're together, they're like together, and then as she's melted into a puddle, they start just flowing away as she spreads out as a puddle. Let's see, what is it? Groove High. I think that's the one of it. You have Zoe melt into a puddle of water after being complimented by Tom, who's disguised as an alternate character named Dom. And she melts into a puddle of water at his feet, and then she reforms herself. But as she melts into that puddle of water, her eyes are closed, and then she reforms herself. And those are the scenarios they'll put in. They're put in where the gag takes place. And like I said, there's all kinds of different scenarios where when this trope or this gag is utilized, that characters are put in. But like I said, the most notable to me are the ones that came out of Animaniacs and Tiny Toons with the likes of Babs and Minerva and even, Plucky, if you want to put him in there. Like I said, and even Dot went through it in Space Probe. She went through it as well. She literally melted in the chair, and the mind reading machine that was on her head fell on top of her as she melted, and all that remained of her in the melted form was her ears just flopped down afterwards, and her little flower ribbon or flower thing in the middle of her ears, and that's it. And then she popped, and then after they lifted up the head thing that was reading her mind, reading her thoughts, that's when she popped back up. But she was put into a scenario that when she melted, that being Dot Warner in Space Probe, in the original Animaniacs, steam was coming out off of her. And she literally, like I said, melted into a puddle, melted into a puddle on the chair. Well, all that remained was her ears and the little flower pin that's in the middle of her ears. And her ears just literally just went plop down. They just literally, flopped down on top of her melted form. And then she reforms herself after they lift up that little head device or mind device that they had on her. So, I know it may sound strange to a lot of people, but to me, when you look at this gag and you look at the scenarios that characters were put in, with this gag, it's really intriguing to see. And this, like I said, if you have a physical copy of that episode of that short on DVD, and you have a DVD player, Blu-ray or Ultra Blu-ray player, and it has the function of stop, step by step, frame by frame, I would suggest utilizing it to see what I'm talking about. Because I know it may not make sense to a lot of you, but it does make sense, and it's when you really think about it in the long run. But what do you guys think? What do you think of, these scenarios the characters were put in? Let me know what your thoughts are down below. Comment if you like. And I'm out.